Dot was another pretty good episode that I simply did enjoy. It had a mix of a couple very interesting, crazy stories that tied together, in my opinion. Um, it was also included the moment to Jason Alexander that was the defining moment of his character, which also I agree is one of I'd say I put this in the top two best George moments, as far as like him like just like trying to just cover up his nonsense, cover up his behavior. It's just the craziest way. Like, just one of the best George moments for sure happened in this episode. It was also an episode where a one-time thing happened, and that was in the cutaways to Jerry, doing his material, where they actually had an interaction with Jerry and somebody in the audience. Hence, in this one, it was Dick, Elaine's boyfriend. Um, but it was a good episode. It's also the first appearance of Richard Fancy, now who is, of course, Mr. Lippman, but in this episode he was called Mr. Breckman. But of course that would be changed to Mr. Lippman, as he would continue to be in the series, I believe, until the opposite, or was that sometime after that where he did appear when Elaine was invited to his son's bar mitzvah. I can't remember if that was before or after the opposite, but it's his first appearance also as well. But yeah, these next 6 reviews, some pretty good episodes. Like I said, these episodes are really getting good, of course, where we're at now. Of course, season 4, again, is the breakthrough season, as it's called. But definitely a lot of my favorites in this series, for sure. But let's talk about the Red Dot. So, the story behind the Red Dot. The episode starts with Jerry and George going to Pendant Publishing, where Elaine works at, because Jerry found Elaine's missing watch under the sofa. So they came to there where Pendant Publishing having their Christmas party. While there, Jerry and George are introduced to Elaine's new boyfriend and co-worker, Dick, who Jerry had been telling George beforehand was a recovering alcoholic. He had been on the wagon for 2 years. Of course, they were just arguing back and forth which one was which, on the wagon, off the wagon, all that jazz. But of course, also, not just was it Elaine's lucky day to get her watch back, but also George, who had been jobless, besides, of course, his little stint moving cars in the cafe. No, sorry, in the alternate side in the previous episode we talked about. He had been unemployed ever since he got fired for poisoning his boss in the previous season. So Elaine basically gives George a chance to work there. She goes, one of the writers left, and she's in charge of finding a replacement. So of course she takes George over to Mr. Breckman, or I'm just calling him Lippman, because again, that's who he was for the rest of the series. This episode he was Mr. Breckman. But he goes over to Lippman, introduces themselves, and he's asking, okay, what kind of, what do you read? What are some authors you like? Of course, George makes us some random stuff, obviously, because he had no clue about anything about writing whatsoever, but the guy needed a job. While that's going on, Jerry and Dick are talking, but they don't seem to really get along too well. Dick had set down his drink, which was cranberry juice. Elaine had set down her drink too and told Jerry to hold on to her drink, which was cranberry juice and vodka. Well, Jerry set the drink down also on the table next to Dick's. Well, when Dick was getting up to leave, obviously, because they were arguing, he accidentally grabbed Elaine's cranberry juice with vodka. And of course, when Elaine realizes that, she freaks out because, again, he's a recovering alcoholic and he could easily fall off the wagon. So thanks to Elaine, George got the job at Pendant Publishing. So Jerry talked him into giving him her thank you gift. They go to the women's section of the store, they find this cashmere sweater, which is pretty expensive. A $600 sweater was discounted down to $85. And he asks one of the people who work there, why is that? Because this little red dot that was on there. And I looked around for so many places. If you can explain down below, but I still did not quite understand what the whole symbol of the red dot was. Was just the fact that, it was just damage to the fabric, or, does it spread germs? Like I said, I couldn't find anywhere explaining what the whole meaning behind the red dot was on the sweater. But obviously, it had some effect, a big effect on it, of course, considering the sweater damaged or whatnot. That's why it was heavily discounted. George, of course, has absolutely no money, takes advantage of it, and gets Elaine the sweater. Of course, then Elaine starts becoming, concerned that about Dick, because he's been acting strange, and she thinks he started drinking again. But then her and Jerry get into some debate over, whether or not you can smell alcohol on someone. So Kramer happened to stop by. They had him drink from a 2-year-old bottle of scotch, Hennigan's. And Kramer drinks Hennigan's, and they couldn't really tell. But Kramer starts walking around making up these Hennigan commercials, which is pretty funny. George came in and, of course, gave Elaine the sweater, which she enjoyed it. But, of course, at the end of the scene, towards the end of the scene, Elaine tries it on, and then no one notices the red dot. Well, of course, Jerry and George know about the red dot, but Elaine does not notice it until Kramer is sitting on the couch and farthest away from everybody else, and he's like, "What's that red dot in your sweater?" And he just turns away, and it's just once again, it's the end of the world over this red dot. Jerry, though, of course, was making it obvious that he knew about the red dot, but he didn't want to, he just couldn't lie and just say, I don't see. He goes, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. So, obviously, he was panicking. He even drank a shot of Hennigan's just to, make him even more loopy and whatnot. So then, Elaine saw George one day at work, and he was staying later. He's like, "Wow, I'm impressed. You're staying late, dedicated, whatnot. Your scene seems to be going well." At the same time, though, the cleaning woman walks by. The cleaning woman, and George goes, "How you doing?" And as she's going through her stuff, just ruffling around, George just looks over and cuts to the next scene. And apparently, George, the cleaning woman, had some fun on the desk in the office, which Larry David mentioned in the Inside Look, obviously, that, that kind of came from him because, sometimes he'd be working late at night in the office, and, he'd be alone there with, the cleaning woman, and him, being who he is, has these fantasies, and let's just say one time I had a fantasy, and it had an outlet to it, basically, implying that happened to him. So, of course, in the episode, though, at the coffee shop, Jerry's asking him about it. Of course, George said what let him do it was Hennigan's, the same stuff that Kramer drank earlier in the episode. And George just describes a moment as he's attracted to a clean woman. She was walking there. She just just the way she was walking around, moving her body. He offered her a drink. They started drinking, and before he knew it, he said she was mopping the floor with him. And then he goes, it was great, except I got sick from the Hennigans. And then Jerry goes, good thing the clean woman was there. And he's like, gotcha. So it's all fine and dandy. But then in the next scene, first, Elaine's there at the apartment telling Jerry that Dick was fired, which probably was because of his behavior from when he started drinking again. And then she's trying to get out of Jerry if George only bought that sweater just because of the discounted price and that he knew the red dot was there. Jerry, of course, tries to cover it up, but Elaine doesn't believe it. So George is coming up, but then Elaine was in the bathroom. George comes in, and I guess, the cleaning lady, their name was Evie, was pushing for a relationship. George didn't want it, but she was also threatening to go tell Littman about their little fun night. And of course, Jerry then warns George about how Elaine is suspicious about the whole red dot thing. So Elaine comes out. She asks George about it, and George was just like, "Are you crazy? In the spirit of Christmas, you would do this?" And then Elaine tricks George, said that Jerry told her that he did buy it because he's cheap. And then George starts freaking out on Jerry, and Jerry goes, "I didn't tell her, she tricked you!" And he starts saying stuff like, "Elaine, you don't get it. I had a 103-degree temperature that day. I was seeing red dots everywhere. I haven't worked in a long time. I got no money. I mean, look at my clothes, Elaine. I'm just a mess." And just throwing a sob story, which is not that defining moment that I was referring to. Um, um, but but so then he's freaking out, and obviously Elaine doesn't want the sweater. So then back at the office later, George is sitting there with Evie, and he gives her a present, which is the cashmere sweater. She goes off on some story about how she was a younger girl in Panama, wherever the heck it was, how there was some guy who she admired his cashmere sweater. And but I guess the guy basically just dragged her across and just hurt her or something like that. So she's trying on the sweater, but then she sees the red dot. Now, before we get to the following scene, we then have a cut to Jerry doing some type of a stand-up scene, again, between, scenes and whatnot. But this time, we have someone start heckling Jerry in the crowd. It was Dick. They actually had him heckling him in the crowd, and I'm wondering if they inserted this in because of how they ended the episode. But he was heckling Jerry. He even made fun of him for Jerry saying that Dick was on the wagon. He goes, "You mean off the wagon?" So even though he was drinking, he knows, what exactly he is. He's off the wagon, not on the wagon. Which of course I think that was added because of what they did at the end of the episode. So then we get to this scene. This is the scene where Jason Alexander says was a defining moment of George, and to me is one of my top 2 George moments. The second one, of course, the second one was not until we get to the non-fat yogurt, which I will talk about that when we get there in a couple seasons. So George is sitting there in Lippman's office, and he basically says that, "I've been informed that you and the clean woman were having a little too much fun on the desk the other night. Is that true?" George sitting there just trying to stay serious, obviously showing that he's running through his head. He's trying to figure out, what to say, and he just goes, "Who said that?" And Lippman goes, "She did." So George backed into a dead end in a corner. He knows he's screwed at this point. He knows whatnot. He can't say she's lying, basically. So, after a brief, long pause, with no change of expression on his face, George just goes, "Was that wrong? Should I not have done that?" He says he has the complete ignorance, because if anybody ever told him that, that was frowned upon here, because, he's worked in how many other offices beforehand, and they did that all the time. That's really... that's just... That was George Costanza purely there. Funny guy, but obviously, he had to lie his way out of a lot of things because of his, dumb luck, as I keep saying. So, obviously, he's just trying to think of some way out of it, and when he's totally busted, instead of course, going back to the 103-degree temperature and seeing red dots everywhere, he goes to, "Was that wrong? Should I not have done that? I didn't know that was wrong," or whatnot, and it was just priceless. And of course, what's also priceless too is I'm always telling people this, even with me watching wrestling and whatnot. I also love how they did a cutaway when he said, "Should I not have done that?" to Lippman's reaction, because sometimes seeing someone else's reaction and hearing the person who's speaking off camera just adds more humor to it. But that didn't work, as Lippman fires him. And then George is like, "Do you really have to say it like that?" And then Lippman just says, "I just want you out here by the end of the day today." He goes, "Okay." He then asks if the Christmas spirit would help at all. Could be a little more lenient there. He's like, "Nah." He goes, "Okay then." He goes, "Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. One more thing. She asked me to give you this." Through the cashmere sweater, and just lands right on George's defeated face. So George is then cleaning up, and then Elaine comes around and she's like, "So I heard what you did, basically." And then he's just like, "You can't say you've never done that before." And Elaine says, I've made out before. And George makes an argument that kissing is sex. Jerry comes by as he was going to take George out to dinner to cheer him up. And he even asks him, "When do you consider sex, happening?" And he says, "Well, when the nipple's exposed," which I think to me was foreshadowing, of course, eventually for a future episode with Elaine's Christmas card. We've had a couple of those. I forgot to mention, when we get to the first episode of season 4, there was one I forgot to mention back in the Chinese restaurant that I hope to remember to mention when we get to the first episode of season 4. But then, of course, Elaine tries to pull that trick on Jerry, like she did on George, which, she had, before Jerry got there, she asked Elaine asked George, did Jerry purposely set Dick up to pick up the wrong drink? George said no. Elaine asked Jerry, and she made something George said that he did, but Jerry didn't fall for it. He goes, "Nice try." But there's a little bit of like a continuity thing here. Like, I didn't like how basically they were talking about Dick, and then they were leading to about to be talking about him because Jerry mentioned, "So guess who heckled me at the club last night?" I don't know why. Like, just I felt like they could have at least like changed that where he said, "Oh, by the way, he was at the club last night heckling me," or it could have like cut him off sooner. But because before they can say who it was, because like to me it was like, it's like this thing where it's like you don't want to mention the subject, like the mystery, like oh, who was it basically, and you just talked about it before, and everyone about to have another conversation about him, but acting like he's a whole new subject. Now I was just like, I don't know about that. But anyways, so then we hear this crashing, and then Dick, who is just fully off the wagon, super drunk, just comes walking down the halls, dragging a Christmas tree. A fully decorated Christmas tree. And of course, Jerry, Elaine, and George, out of fear, hide under George's desk. And obviously, he spots them, and he stands in front of the desk. And out of fear, George hands Dick the cashmere sweater. And same thing. Is that cashmere? Of course it's cashmere. The typical routine. And of course it ends with the, "What's this?" And that's the end. Well, that's how it was supposed to end. But then, I guess, Castle Rock and NBC executives were saying stuff like, I don't think that's right to have him, end it with him, fully wasted and off the wagon. So it's like, we gotta kind of fix that ending a little bit. So during the last scene of stand-up with Jerry, he does talk about how he thinks he may have accidentally gotten someone back on alcohol again. He said, hopefully he's okay, hopefully he got back off the wagon. And of course, again, someone corrects me in the cross, you mean on the wagon. And sure enough, it's Dick with a woman, and he holds up a drink, showing that it was a non-alcoholic beverage, to show that, he, got back to sobriety again. Which was the way they felt was the proper way to end. But that was also, the only time in the series they had ever had an interaction with Jerry in the crowd during one of his cutaway stand-up scenes, and at the ending as well. And that's the Red Dot. Again, good episode, underrated a little bit, but I still feel like it's a more known episode. Like I said, that Jason Alexander and I do agree, that was one of the best George moments. Was that wrong? Should I not have done that? Good stuff, of course. But guys, that is the Red Dot review. Next review would be the episode called The Suicide, which actually is the first on-screen appearance of a very popular reoccurring character. Who is that? We'll talk about him next. So once again, guys, what are your thoughts on the Red Dot episode? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Do you also think that the scene with George and Lippman, with George getting fired, was one of George's best scenes as well, or best moments in the series. Leave thoughts down in the comment section below, and be sure as always to slap a like on the video, subscribe for more content to my channel, and follow me on Twitter at DemandAirBoy93. Till then, guys, I'm checking out. I'll see y'all later. Have a good night. Peace out, everybody.